Joining us now, as he will all week, Kwame McKenzie. He is Medical Director of Diversity and Mental Health at CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and a Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto, and we're very happy to have you back in that chair in our studio. Thanks, Quame.
Good evening.
We should tell everybody that you're here, as we suggested, for the first of 5 Monday to Friday interviews across the week, exploring the theme of encounters with the other. That's what we're calling it. And we're kicking things off by talking to you about your experiences of being a black man who's lived in 3 pretty significant cities around the world, born in London, UK, also lived in Boston, now living in Toronto. And why don't we start there? How did you end up over here in this city?
In Toronto?
Yeah.
Well, Toronto, I think, is a great place. It's one of the most diverse places in the world. And I came really to try and help with developing mental health services for the diverse population here. If it's going to work anywhere in the world, it's going to work in Toronto. And so Toronto is a much greater challenge with regards to diversity than the UK, and certainly than London. And so I'm here to see if I can make a difference.
Let me pick up on that, and let's just, if we can, Michael, bring up the numbers on London, UK. Here are the largest ethnic groups, according to the UK Office for National Statistics. 6.1% of the population over there is so-called Indian, 5.3% Black African, 4.8% Black Caribbean. You know, I know people in Toronto always talk about the black community, when in fact there really are several black communities. Is it that way in London as well?
Most definitely. I mean, when you're talking about the Black Caribbean group, they're people who came over to the UK as invited workers. So in the 1950s, after the war, England had a labour shortage and really needed to try and build. It needed to build everything. It lost a lot of people in the war. And so people went out to the colonies, and mainly at that time the Caribbean, and said to people, your mother country needs you. Come and help us build the new England.
Which obviously is a huge difference from being brought over in slave ships.
In some ways, most definitely. It was different in that it was a choice and you were being paid. But when people came over to the UK, people like my father and mother, they came over and they saw signs that they'd never seen before. You know, on the guest houses it would say things like, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. And they'd never seen anything like that and didn't expect that at all.
That was a shock.
An incredible shock. The people had been asked to come over and help, and they were coming over and help, and the reception they received was not what they expected.
So how difficult was it to integrate into a society where you were faced with that kind of a stark reality?
Well, it was difficult for them, but the first generation of immigrants often keep to themselves. So people stay in their groups and they stay sort of geographically segregated by choice sometimes. The problems usually happen in the second generation when you have people like me who are born and brought up in the country, and you decide you're going to move out into the rest of the society where actually all the money is in order to make your fortune or to do something more with your life.
So your folks were from where originally?
From the Caribbean. So
which country?
From Dominica and from a place called Carriacou, which is an incredibly small island just off the coast of Grenada.
Now I'm guessing they did not sound like you sound.
They didn't sound that different. They haven't got very strong Caribbean accents. The Caribbean accent in Carriacou is quite smooth, as it is in Dominica. And if you're wondering about where this public school accent came from, it didn't come from a public school. When I say public school, of course, in the UK, public schools are private schools, and the sort of idea of public schools here are state schools.
Oh, okay.
So it did not come from a private school. I went to a state school in the UK.
But I mean, you clearly sound like a Brit, and my hunch is they did not.
They didn't, but that's often the case in the second generation, because up to the age of, say, for instance, 5, you're at home. From 5 onwards, you're at school, and some of the major influences that you have at school are your peers, and your peers often don't speak in an accent unless you're in a school that's not very diverse. And so your accent is bound to change.
Now, I presume by the time you got to your formative years growing up in Britain, those signs that would have so offended your parents were gone. Wasn't that the case?
Most definitely, and there were different sorts of things that then really got under your skin. So one of the things you'll hear in the UK is the UK will talk about being a very tolerant society. We're very tolerant of the ethnic minorities in the UK.
And is it?
Well, whether it is or it isn't, I mean, I can't see whether you've got a wedding ring on, but if you have a wedding ring, so if you're in a marriage and you go home and you're tolerated, are you going to thrive? I mean, are you thriving?
So that's the you felt tolerated but not welcomed.
Why? Yes, born, brought up, raised, paying my taxes, trying to better the health system over there, and tolerated. That's the rhetoric that comes out of government. That's not good enough.
Yeah, let's pursue this a bit. Give me some examples of what sort of typical life would have been like for you over there in London that gave you the distinct impression that you were merely tolerated as opposed to welcomed as a part of the community.
So let's get it right. This is actually the rhetoric of race relations and multiculturalism and government in the UK, that people say we're very tolerant of our ethnic minorities. It wasn't that I had experiences. The experiences I had in London were very different over the years. Probably my first experience that really is in my mind of racial difference in the UK was in the 70s, when I must have been 8 or 9. There was a riot in my hometown of Southall. What had happened was that the local mayor had decided that it was a good idea to allow freedom of speech, and freedom of speech meant that a neo-Nazi group were going to be allowed to have a meeting in the local town hall. And the local population, 50% South Asian, decided this wasn't good, and they decided to do a silent, Gandhi-like sit-down protest, at which time the police came along and they were just hauling them away. Police on horses, beating women over the back.
The protesters?
The protesters.
Not the Nazis?
No, they were making a space for the Nazis to go in to have their democratic meeting. And these were the sorts of things that you thought you'd never see, certainly when you were young, because it really changed my view of British society.
So when we pride ourselves on being tolerant, that's actually a buzzword that some see as actually quite insulting. You don't want to be tolerated, you want to be welcomed, accepted.
You're a citizen.
Right.
If you're a citizen, you're a citizen.
Okay, that's London. Let's turn to Boston now. And again, let's do the same thing we did before. Let's put up the chart showing the ethnic breakdown in Boston, Massachusetts. 50% of the population in Boston, white. 22%, significant chunk, black or African American. 16% Hispanic or Latino. 8% Asian. 1% Native American. 1% multiracial, and 2% described as other. Those figures courtesy of the U.S. Census Bureau. Okay, Boston's history of race relations is, I think, probably much better known to our viewers than that of London. You were at Harvard, right, in Boston?
Yes.
Okay, so you're in what I'm presuming at the time was a sea of white faces, and there's you. How did that feel?
Lovely, actually.
Really?
Well, in many ways, because I was a black face speaking with this, as you've drawn attention to already, sort of received pronunciation English accent. So that made me an exotic. And exotic people are welcomed with open arms. You get into the best parties, you get treated incredibly well.
So not tolerated, but actually welcomed.
Welcomed.
Difference.
Welcomed. And the life in and around sort of Boston at Harvard Medical School, or at sort of Harvard, the central bit in Cambridge, is fabulous as long as you don't leave that area, because it is such a refined existence that you have a wonderful time. But if you move just two miles away from the downtown campus, you hit places that are 70, 80% of immigrant populations, completely different from the Cambridge area and the Boston area. And those places are poor, they're dangerous, they're full of despair. They're completely different.
Are you talking about, I went to school in Boston too, but I was on the south side of the Charles River, not the north side.
Okay.
So, and I lived very close to Roxbury, which was the black neighborhood, but that wasn't an immigrant neighborhood. That's just a poor black neighborhood. Is that what you're referring to? It was,
and these things change over time. So as people develop a bit of money, they try to move out, and new immigrants come in. So there's Roxbury, there's Dorchester, there are places like that.
And are those the places where, now would you have felt comfortable walking around Roxbury?
I was fairly comfortable walking around Roxbury during the day, but I didn't know where I was going at night. I'd have probably felt more comfortable walking around Roxbury than I would of being stuck late at night down in the Irish part of Boston in
North End.
Southie.
Yeah.
The Italian part's North End.
Okay.
The South End, Southie is the Irish part. And those at that time, and this was back in the 90s, were no-go areas if you were black. You just didn't go there because you would be attacked.
Now that's very interesting because, of course, the conventional wisdom would be you as a black man ought to feel comfortable in Roxbury, any time of day, because you've got the same skin color as 80% of the people or 90% of the people who live there. But of course, you're a med student at Harvard, in which case you might not want to be hanging around in an area where there's lots of drugs and crime.
Yeah, I think people are sort of quite sophisticated. I had some friends I remember at Harvard who were very into sort of being African, and I remember one of them telling me the story of they'd all been in America all their life, went over to Ghana, got off the plane and was saying, "Africa, home," and everybody was sitting there saying, "What's that American doing here?" And it's the same thing. I could walk into Roxbury, but people know who I was. I mean, I didn't fit.
Now, when you lived in Boston, though, Boston is the city of busing. Boston is the city where there are a lot of kind of, all right, I'm sorry, let me just say, redneck Irish people who, hate minorities, never mind visible minorities, but any minorities.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a feature of the city. It is a historical fact. It's better today than it was, 25 years ago, but it is a fact. Did you feel comfortable living in that city?
Well, that's the problem with living in a rarefied environment, such as going to Harvard or spending any time there, is that I was completely comfortable. I lived in Brookline. I went to downtown to the medical school, or I went up to the Cambridge campus.
So all nice places.
All incredibly nice places. So that's what it was like. But it's a different story for people who have to live on the hard end of Boston.
Sure. Okay, last 5 minutes, let's do Toronto. And again, the numbers we can start with, these from the city of Toronto itself. Percentage of visible minority groups in this city, 12% South Asian, 11.5% almost Chinese, 8.5% almost Black, 4% plus Filipino, 2.5% plus Latin American. As you think about the continuum of London versus Boston, is Toronto more like Boston or more like London?
One of the things that you said made me think that it was more like Boston than it was more like London. When we're talking about London, we actually broke it down by the African population and the Caribbean population. And we talked about difference, and they've got different histories and different reasons for being where they are. When we talk about Toronto, we almost always talk about the black population as if there is one. If you even look at where people live, the Caribbean origin population and the African population have some commonalities, but are actually different.
Yes.
Very, very different in when they came, why they came, how they came. And some of the Caribbean origin populations have been here a lot longer. So it's, but people think of black, white, brown, really.
Right.
It's almost like a sort of a paint chart
Well,
when you think about it.
There are some people in this city, of course, who want to say the right thing and be very politically correct, and so they might look at you and instead of calling you a black man, they might want to call you an African Canadian, which is an expression that goes around. And if they were to say that to you, how would you react to that?
Well, actually, without being flippant, I'd start off by saying, if CIC Canada want to give me landed immigrant status, then I'll call myself African Canadian. At the moment, I've still got a British passport.
Oh, okay.
I have no problem with the idea of being African Canadian.
But you don't have direct ties to Africa.
No, I would probably say Caribbean Canadian myself. But black Canadian is probably means as little as anything else.
So what, when you ask anybody, what's your ethnic background, what do you say?
Me?
Yeah.
I say I'm British.
You say you're British, okay.
That's because I am.
Yeah.
And then they say, no, where are you really from? And I say, I was born in London. They say, no, where were you really from? And if I was going to get more and more flippant, I'll say, well, we were all generated from Africa, and then, you know, but they want to know that, you know, it's Caribbean origin rather than African origin, and then they say, you've got this name Kwame, you know, that's African, and you say, well, my parents like Kwame and Nkrumah, but it got anglicised, so I'm Quam, and you go through this whole rigmarole.
Got it.
But people ask it of me. No one asks you where you're from.
Huh. So this notion of the other that we're exploring, do you feel in Toronto less like the other than you might have in another place?
I am the other in Toronto.
You
I'm
are.
a newcomer. I am a newcomer.
So you're the other because you're born in England and you're a newcomer,
Yeah, I'm a
but
newcomer.
not necessarily because of the color of your skin?
That's a difficult one, because one of the things, when I first came to Toronto, one of the things that I thought when I was downtown is, I didn't realise there were no black people here. And it wasn't until a good friend of mine took me out and showed me you know, the priority neighbourhoods and showed me around Toronto and the suburbs that I understood where the black people were.
Huh. Yes, that's right, because
They're not downtown.
they're not downtown. That's
No.
right. Well, this is a fascinating start to our week, Quam. Thank you so much for getting it started, and we shall see you again tomorrow, okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.